The next question has to do with synthetic control arms, and this was a question that I came up with some help from some experts that I spoke to, and Wayne actually, when registering this, came up with a question on that as well. But in clinical trials, synthetic control arms can save a lot of time and money, and it also eliminates the concerns patients have around getting a placebo rather than the actual drug. It seems like real-world evidence is a way of modeling patient data in that synthetic control arm using data gathered from EHRs, claims data, and other sources. I realize I'm asking each of you here to kind of look into your crystal ball and make a prediction, but I'm hoping each of you can tell us what you think the future holds for real-world data and real-world evidence and its use in synthetic control arms in clinical trials. And Gregg, can we go ahead and have you start with your prediction?
Yeah, Ed, but I want to, before I do, it's a good question, but I want to step back for a second. In our clinical trials in the United States, influenza is recommended for 6 months and older on an annual basis. So we can't give a placebo in the sense of we can't give a sugar water in a vaccine, sterile sugar water. So it has to be the standard of care. So we would actually use a licensed influenza vaccine compared to our new vaccine. And if we are in another part of the world where, in fairness, they don't recommend flu for somebody that's 20 years old, and we're going to study it in a 20-year-old, we'll give a different vaccine so that we just don't give a placebo. But with that said, I think that this idea of using data from real world to help us understand how better to set up clinical trials using that synthetic control is a marvelous idea. And I think that as we continue to learn about real world data and as we continue to mine it, I think that there's an awful lot that's going on. One of the things that we try to do is we track influenza across the globe, right? Because, I mean, really, that's how the World Health Organization and the FDA decide what 4 strains to go into an influenza vaccine. And so if we're tracking and we find out that we're going to places where if we're going to set up a trial for the United States to get it licensed in the United States, and we're somewhere where the strains are vastly different than they are in the U.S., that should tell us that our clinical trials may need to pivot to go places where, in fact, the similar strains are circulating. So I think there's a lot that can be done using real-world evidence to help our clinical colleagues with the clinical development program.
Perfect. And Christoph, synthetic control arms, is that something you guys are looking into, and do you see its use growing in the future?
Absolutely. I think there's no question that synthetic control arms are continuously and even more being used during the clinical trial process. For example, one of the things we're looking at in the collaboration with hallmarks that I introduced earlier is we specifically are looking at an ability to develop synthetic control arms in the mental health space. Yeah. I do, however, and I think that's important, want to point out that obviously synthetic control arms have been successful, but there have been a lot of examples as well where synthetic control arm have not been successful. Yeah. And I think you always have to ask yourself, when you use a synthetic control arm, what are you looking at? Yeah, is it a well-defined natural history that you are observing? Yeah, is it an objective endpoint? Yeah, are the patients comparable between your synthetic control arm as well as your active control, your active arm? You need to make sure that you're fully aware of all the covariate measurements. Yeah, and I think that is important, that when you make a decision to use a synthetic control arm, it has to fit the specific intervention that you're testing. Yeah, and you have to make sure that the synthetic control that you're using is really matching up with you as well. Yeah, because any regulator else will very carefully scrutinize how valid your synthetic control is as a comparison to your active arm.
And just a couple of quick follow-ups. Lisa just asked a question. You were talking earlier, you mentioned a company that you guys were using, I think when you were talking about mental health. I did not jot that down, but what was the company that you mentioned?
Yeah, so that's the company called Holmus. Yeah, so that's a data company that is specifically building up data capability in the mental health space.
And is that Holmus, Holmas? Is that close?
It's Holmusk.
Holmusk. Okay, thank you. I hope you got that, Lisa. And then one other question I just wanted to bounce off you real quick before we move on to the next speaker. Priya had asked, do you use e-consent to make sure real-world patients are aware that their data is being used in research? With the way that data comes in, is it possible to e-consent all those folks? And is that something that companies are attempting to do?
It's a little bit more complicated. So first of all, we almost routinely now use e-consent in all our clinical trials because it just simplifies things. In the example I gave earlier, where, for example, you would tokenize patient data to follow them beyond the clinical trial, that is something that, in my opinion, you should consent or e-consent a patient when they enter a clinical trial so that they're completely aware of how you utilize the data and the fact that you are using them. Yeah, for all purpose, the approach we are having is that patients need to be informed about what you're using, how much of the data you're using, and what you're using it for, regardless whether it's a real-world evidence generation activity or whether it's a traditional randomized controlled clinical trial. And that should be your guidance.